You know, folks like to think the Romans always had it figured out. Legions marching in perfect order, swords flashing in the sun, empire stretching from one sea to the next. But the truth is, Rome didn't come into the world fully armed with discipline and steel. No, it took over 12 centuries of trial, error, and adaptation. In the early days, Roman soldiers fought more like Greek hoplites. Big round shields, heavy spears, and short bronze or iron swords that were really just backup in case the fighting got too close for comfort. You lost your spear, then you drew steel. That was the order of things. But when Rome stepped into the Second Punic War, everything began to shift. The Roman legionary was no longer just a spear carrier who happened to have a sword. He was becoming a dedicated swordsman. And that meant they needed a different kind of sword. One that was reliable, quick, and could hold up to the brutal close combat of that time. That's when they found it. Out in Hispania, they came across a blade used by the local tribes. It was sturdy, well-balanced, and deadly in the right hands. And just like that, the Gladius Hispanis became the blade that built an empire. Welcome back to Heroic History, your daily stop for stories behind the arms and engineering of the ancient world. Today, we're diving into the sword that turned Rome's infantry into a fearsome force and changed Roman warfare forever. If that sounds like your kind of history, go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. There's a lot more to uncover, and we'd be glad to have you along for the journey. Now let's get started. In 218 BC, the Roman Republic stood tall, confident, perhaps even a little too sure of itself. They had already clashed with Carthage once during the First Punic War and emerged as victors. But the Second Punic War would be a far different beast. Carthage now placed its hopes in a young commander named Hannibal Barca, and from the very beginning, he shattered Roman expectations. Marching his army across the snowbound Alps, an audacious move few thought possible, Hannibal brought the war directly onto Italian soil, striking from the unguarded north. Before Rome became the great imperial juggernaut we know today, its armies borrowed heavily from their Greek neighbors. Early Republican legions fought in tightly packed formations that resembled the phalanx, shields locked, shoulders aligned, spears bristling out like the quills of a giant beast. It was a wall of bronze and discipline, dependent on order and cohesion. Their primary weapon was the long hasta, a thrusting spear that kept enemies at bay, while short swords were carried only as backup, strapped at the hip, drawn only when the spear broke or when the line collapsed into the chaos of close-quarters fighting. These early Roman swords were modeled after the Greek xiphos, short, double-edged, and well-suited for stabbing in tight ranks. But they were secondary tools, serviceable yet hardly decisive. Their short length limited reach, their durability was questionable, and they were never intended to sustain the brunt of prolonged combat. In a formation built around the spear, the sword was an afterthought. But Hannibal didn't fight like a Greek. He didn't wait behind rows of leveled spears. He moved with fluidity and speed, treating the battlefield like one where he could lure, flank, and ambush at will. Against his fast-moving forces, especially his fierce Iberian infantry and nimble Numidian cavalry, Rome's rigid blocks became liabilities. The once reliable phalanx became a trap. Long spears, ideal for pushing forward in a straight line, became cumbersome in broken terrain. Rome quickly learned the hard way that their old-school tactics just weren't cutting it anymore. Their formations were too stiff, their weapons weren't versatile enough, and it showed badly. Over the next few years, they took loss after loss. The River Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and the worst of all, Cannae. In that one battle alone, over 50,000 Roman soldiers were wiped out in a single day. It was a brutal reckoning. Hannibal's brilliance, and especially the effectiveness of his multi-ethnic troops like the Iberian infantry, exposed just how outdated the Roman military had become. So the Romans had to rethink everything. They abandoned the clunky phalanx and reorganized their legions into smaller, more flexible units called manipuli. These could move and react independently, which was a game changer. And with that change came a new need. Their long spears were suddenly a liability. The Romans needed something shorter, quicker, and more lethal at close quarters, something that could adapt to the messy, fragmented realities of modern battle, and fate, as it often does in war, delivered the answer. While Hannibal rampaged through Italy, the Romans opened a second front far to the west, in Hispania, modern-day Spain, hoping to cut off Carthaginian reinforcements and supplies. There, in the jagged highlands and thick forests of the Iberian Peninsula, Roman soldiers encountered a very different kind of war and a very different kind of warrior: the Celtiberians. These were tribal fighters of mixed Celtic and Iberian blood, tough, fast, and fearless. They didn't march in neat formations or trade javelins across flat plains. They vanished into the trees, struck from the hills, and hurled themselves into ferocious hand-to-hand brawls. And in those swirling melees, the Romans met a blade unlike any they had ever seen. It was short, leaf-shaped, double-edged, and viciously pointed. It looked like a cross between a leaf and a claw, wide enough to slash deep through flesh and bone, yet tapered to a point that could punch clean through armor and gut a man in one sudden lunge. The Celtiberians wielded these blades with terrifying skill. They darted in close and struck with surgical precision. An upward stab under the ribs, a downward slash across the knee, a sideways cut to the neck or armpit, a medium-length weapon heavy enough to hack, balanced enough to thrust, and perfect for the unpredictable, uneven terrain of Iberia. To the Roman legions, it was a revelation. Livy wrote that Roman soldiers shuddered at how easily these Iberian swords could sever limbs, decapitate men, or spill a man's guts with a single stroke. In battles across central Spain, the Romans began to realize just how outclassed their old Italian blades had become. Their long, slender swords were slow, unwieldy, and ineffective in tight combat. Meanwhile, Celtiberian warriors sliced through shields, parried with ease, and left the battlefield littered with the brutal evidence of their craftsmanship. Celtiberia, what is now central Spain, especially around modern Soria, Zaragoza, and Guadalajara, was blessed with something far more valuable than gold: accessible veins of iron and copper lying close enough to the surface to be mined with Bronze Age tools. The mountains of the Iberian Range and the highlands near the upper Ebro Valley were dotted with ore, and the people who lived there knew exactly what to do with it. The Celtiberians were warriors, yes, but more than that, they were smiths. Across sites like Numantia and Termiana, archaeologists have uncovered traces of large-scale metallurgy, bloomery furnaces, slag heaps, iron ingots, and even casting molds. These weren't just village blacksmiths hammering out horseshoes. These were full-scale ironworks, turning raw ore into weapons of war. So, how did this technology develop in such a seemingly remote place? Part of the answer lies in geography, but the rest comes down to war. From as early as the 5th century BC, Celtiberian tribes were constantly fighting against each other, against the Lusitani, the Vacaei, and eventually against the Carthaginians and the Romans. That constant pressure created one of the oldest truths: the best weapons come from necessity. Celtiberian warriors needed blades that could be reliable, durable, easily repaired, and most importantly, deadly. But for the Celtiberians, these swords were more than just tools of war. They were symbols of honor. In warrior graves from Alto Jalón to Numantia, archaeologists have found broken swords buried alongside their owners. That's why these were swords crafted with pride. The Celtiberians were a fusion people descended from migrating Celts and native Iberians. Their weapons reflected both traditions. From the Celts, they inherited late iron metalwork, cold forging, inlay, and segmental construction. From the Iberians, they absorbed an artistic sense of form and structure rooted in geometry and local symbolism. Their land also sat on key trade routes, stretching from Phoenician ports like Emporion and Saguntum to Greek, Carthaginian, and later Roman merchants. Through these routes came exotic designs and techniques. That's why some Celtiberian scabbards and hilts show Etruscan curves or Punic motifs. They adapted, selectively refining foreign elements to elevate their own weapon design. The result was a blade unlike any other in Europe at the time. If you actually held one of these early Hispaniensis swords in your hand, the first thing you'd notice is that classic leaf shape. It flares out in the middle and tapers toward the tip, almost like a flattened teardrop. This wasn't just for looks. That shape made it excellent for both slicing and thrusting. The blade length usually ran somewhere between 60 and 68 cm, and nearly all of that was usable edge. It stayed straight, double-edged with a sharp triangular point designed to punch through enemy flesh and sometimes even armor. The widest part of the blade could be up to 7 centimeters across. That extra width meant when you swung sideways, the cut hit harder. And to help manage the weight, many of these swords had a groove down the middle, what's called a fuller. It lightened the sword, made it stiffer, and kept it from bending out of shape during a heavy clash. What really stood out, though, was the sword's point. It was always sharp, narrow, and stiff, often shaped in what some people call a wasp waist design. Basically, the blade would narrow a bit before widening again just ahead of the tip. That made it even better at stabbing through leather armor or the kinds of light shields used back then. It was a real killer in close quarters fighting, especially when facing enemies without heavy protection. To make a weapon like that truly reliable in battle, you also needed the right material. And more importantly, you had to know how to work it. That's where Celtiberian metalwork came into play. As early as the 5th century BC, they had already figured out how to smelt this ore using bloomery furnaces. Primitive, but effective. With hand-powered bellows, they could reach temperatures around 100–200 degrees C, hot enough to separate iron from the rock. What they pulled from the furnace was called a bloom, a spongy lump of iron and slag, but that was just the beginning. From there, their blacksmiths would hammer it over and over to drive out impurities, fold it again and again, and forge it into something stronger. This repeated folding wasn't just for show. It made the blade both tougher and more flexible, far less likely to snap in the chaos of combat. Some Celtiberian swords from burial sites even show early examples of pattern welding. That's the advanced technique, where layers of soft and hard iron are fused to create a blade that can bend without breaking, but still hold a razor edge. This was centuries ahead of its time, and almost unheard of across the Mediterranean back then. They didn't stop there. Celtiberian smiths began mixing iron with different carbon contents, soft iron for the core, harder steel for the edges. It was their way of controlling the sword's behavior. Resilient spine, hard edge, minimal risk of fracture. Some swords even show signs of selective hardening. The edge treated with carbon-rich materials like bone charcoal or dung to harden only the parts that needed it. And here's what's really impressive. They did all this without thermometers. Just by reading the color of hot metal, once the blade hit the right phase, what we now call austenite, they'd quench it in water, plant oil, or even urine to lock in the structure. Not only that, but they didn't quench the whole thing. They did it in sections, leaving the spine of the sword slightly soft and springy, while the edge stayed sharp and rigid. This helped the blade absorb shocks without breaking. As for the grip, most were made from wood, bone, or antler, shaped into a simple cylinder with a slight bulge in the middle. That little swell helped keep the sword from slipping when your palms got sweaty or blood slick. The guard, just a modest wooden lip, really enough to stop your hand from sliding onto the blade. At the other end, you had the pommel, a rounded nub of bone or wood that capped everything off. Its job was to keep the sword balanced and hold the parts together. But even with that no-nonsense build, the handle often came in 3 parts: the grip, the guard, and the pommel. And sometimes they were carved in little geometric patterns or symbols, especially ones tied to Celtic tradition. So even though it was a weapon, It also told you something about the person holding it. This wasn't just steel, it was pride, heritage, and identity, all wrapped up in one blade. And then there's the scabbard, usually made from wood and wrapped in leather with iron or copper fittings at the mouth and tip. They protected both the sword and the man wearing it. Some even had tin or silver inlays, or were etched with geometric designs, sometimes even the owner's name. When you saw one of these hanging off a soldier's hip, you didn't just see a sheath. You saw status, you saw meaning, and the craftsmanship. That didn't stop at the blade. They peened the tangs for strength, reinforced grips with bronze or silver bands, and made sure the whole thing could survive more than just one battle. The Romans weren't like the Greeks. They didn't pride themselves on grand ideals, elegant philosophy, or the art of refined warfare. No, the Romans wielded something colder, something sharper, ruthless practicality and iron discipline. From very early on, Rome adopted a simple but unforgiving mindset. If it helps us win, we take it. We remake it, and we make it better. They didn't care where it came from, enemy, ally, or so-called barbarian. What mattered was whether it worked. And that's what you see when you look at Roman military culture. For the Romans, ego meant nothing. Survival meant everything. Creativity was nice, but effectiveness won battles. And if learning from the enemy helped them win, they never hesitated. They didn't invent much from scratch. But nearly every Roman war machine, formation, or tactic was an improved version of something someone else had once used against them. The Greeks had ideals, the Romans had results. To them, war was the greatest teacher. In the Roman mind, war wasn't a place for personal glory. It was a civic duty, a responsibility to protect Roman order from the chaos outside. They didn't look at neighboring peoples with contempt. They studied them with the eyes of a craftsman, picking out the best tools. When they fought the Samnites, they learned to use the long oval shield, the scutum, and made it standard issue. When they clashed with the Etruscans and Greeks, they took their architecture, social organization, and even their styles of combat. That's why the gladius hispanis wasn't just an effective weapon, it was a perfect match for Roman thinking. So around 209 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, ordered these swords to be collected, studied, and reproduced. Roman forges were soon crafting their own version. Romanization of the sword, modified with hilts better suited to Roman hands. The original design had already proven its worth. A straight, double-edged blade, sharp point, good for both cutting and thrusting. But the Romans tweaked it to fit their own needs. Disciplined ranks, tight formations, and brutal close quarters fighting. They kept the blade length about 60 to 68 centimeters, but refined the shape. That curved leaf-like outline got straightened out, and the point became more prominent. Why? Because in a Roman formation, you're thrusting forward from behind a tall scutum shield, not swinging wildly. They also toned down or completely removed the wasp waist curve in the middle. Less fancy, more durable, and it made production easier too. To cut down on weight without weakening the blade, they added shallow grooves, fullers running along its length. The steel they used was still low carbon, but the Romans started standardizing the forging process. They hardened the edges while keeping the core softer. That way, the blade could hold a sharp edge, but still take a beating without snapping, ideal for repeated clashes in a melee. The hilt got a Roman makeover too. The handguard, the part that keeps your fingers from sliding onto the blade, became larger and sturdier, usually made from hardwood or bone. The grip itself took on a rigid, segmented shape, like a series of small spheres, so it wouldn't slip, even if your hand was slick with sweat or blood. And the pommel, that little cap at the end, wasn't just decorative anymore. They'd sometimes add lead or bronze inside to act as a counterweight, improving the sword's balance when swung. Even the scabbard, the sword's home, got the Roman treatment. They built them from wood lined with metal like tin or bronze and covered them in leather. A loop or ring at the mouth let the soldier hang it on his right hip, tilted just right so he could draw it quickly with his right hand while holding his shield with the left. And instead of tribal designs, the scabbards now bore legion symbols, Roman deities, or geometric patterns, a badge of honor as much as a practical tool. And so the Gladius Hispanis was born, a short sword that could still slash when needed, but was absolutely lethal when used to thrust. It had a sharp, narrow point that could punch through chainmail and a broad blade that gave it versatility in the brutal chaos of close-quarters fighting. It was a perfect match for Rome's new manipular system. Instead of the old rigid formations like the Greek phalanx, Roman troops were now organized into more flexible lines of hastati, principes, and triarii. That flexibility gave each soldier room to maneuver. Although slashing was still an option, Roman training emphasized thrusting. The sword was optimized to deliver powerful, accurate stabs, usually aimed at the abdomen, groin, or thighs. Those were weak points in most enemy armor, and a single well-placed thrust could end a fight instantly. That gave the gladius a huge edge over the longer Greek swords or the curved blades from the east. Even the formation itself was built with the gladius in mind. Soldiers stood with enough space between them to use the sword's full range of motion, especially from behind their large shields. In battle, a Roman would block or push with his shield, open a gap, and then strike through it, quick and brutal. Interestingly, Republican legionaries wore their swords on the right side, making it easier to draw with the right hand without bumping into their neighbor's gear. It's a small detail, but it shows just how well thought out the entire system was, from weapon design to battlefield behavior. Early versions of the Hispanis were actually quite long, which meant each soldier needed a bit more elbow room to use it effectively. That need for space directly influenced how Republican formations were structured, wider and more open than the tighter formations you'd see later in the empire. Archaeologically, we've found quite a few examples of early Hispanienses, which proves how widespread it was in Rome's early Republican military. The most impressive finds include two nearly intact swords discovered at Grad in Slovenia, dating to around 200 to 190 BC. These are considered textbook examples of the early Hispan. Other fragments have turned up in places like Al-Fared in Spain, close to the Celtiberian heartland, as well as Delos in Greece and Uria, tracking the path of Rome's growing military presence across the Mediterranean. More than just a change in arms, the adoption of the Hispanis marked a shift in mindset. Rome was moving away from slow, rigid warfare toward mobility, individual skill, and battlefield adaptability, hallmarks of what would soon become the Roman legion. By the time Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC, the Roman army had completely transformed. Gone was the clumsy force that had been crushed at Cannae. In its place stood a nimble, deadly machine of war. And right at the heart of that change was the Gladius Hispanensis, both a symbol and a tool of Rome's rise. Over the next century, the traditional Hispanis had served the manipular legions well. In the fluid, semi-open formations of the early Republic against opponents like the Samnites, Celts, or Carthaginians. Such a weapon made perfect sense. It rewarded individual skill, upper body strength, and agility in melee combat. As Rome expanded its military reach and professionalized its ranks, the original Hispanis began to shift. From this transformation emerged what scholars often call the late Hispanis, a transitional form bridging the older Republican model with what would eventually become the imperial Mainz-type gladius. By the late 2nd century BC, the battlefield had changed. Rome was now facing better armored enemies, more disciplined formations, and crucially other Roman-trained forces. During the brutal civil wars, phalanxes in the east, shielded Greek warriors and rebel legions loyal to Marius, Sulla, or Caesar posed new tactical challenges. In this new environment, speed and penetration mattered more than reach or sweeping cuts. The chaotic close-range nature of legionary combat, often fought shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, favored quick, accurate thrusts over wide slashes. The late Hispanis answered that need. Its blade was slightly shorter, making it easier to draw quickly when packed tightly among comrades behind large scutum shields. The silhouette also began to shift. The blade broadened near the base and narrowed toward a more acute, elongated tip, foreshadowing the triangular thrusting point of the Mainz gladius. These changes weren't just for looks. A narrower, more pointed tip pierced armor more effectively. A shortened blade reduced draw time and allowed faster stabs in tight formation. And a wider blade base increased the twisting force on impact, crippling enemies with a single thrust. The hilt, too, evolved. The transitional sword began to feature more segmented grips, a defined guard, and a rounded pommel that acted as a counterweight. These improvements gave soldiers better control and balance, especially important when fighting in confined space under strict formation. In fact, the hilt's redesign reflected a broader shift from a sword made for personal dueling to a weapon engineered for systematized collective warfare. The Roman soldier was no longer an individual warrior relying on personal prowess. He was now a cog in a highly disciplined combat machine, and his sword had to match that reality. From a logistical perspective, this transformation was also strategic. As Rome moved from a citizen militia to a standing professional army, exercitus, it needed weapons that could be mass-produced, easily repaired, and standardized across units. Advances in metallurgy allowed for thinner yet tougher blades, eliminating the need for a central ridge once thought necessary to maintain strength. Roman blacksmiths, many working in state-run fabricae, now had the knowledge and means to produce uniform, high-quality weapons with astonishing efficiency. The result was a lighter, deadlier weapon that could be issued by the thousands, each one part of a logistical chain that stretched across continents. And the transformation didn't stop with the blade. For the professional Roman soldier, especially in the increasingly hierarchical and stratified legions of the late Republic and early Empire, a gladius was a mark of belonging. It said, "I am Rome, I serve the eagle." The gladius was never just a blade, it was a symbol of loss, of learning, and of legacy. Forged in Iberia, perfected in Roman workshops, it told a story far bigger than any one soldier. It was the edge Rome used not just to conquer, but to evolve. Each time it was drawn, it whispered of battles lost and won, of foreign ideas reborn in Roman hands, of a civilization bold enough to borrow and ruthless enough to master. In the gladius, Rome didn't just carry steel, it carried memory, resolve, and destiny. Thanks for watching. Let us know in the comments which Roman weapon do you want us to explore next. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again tomorrow as we uncover more stories forged in fire and sharpened by time.